I'm Dustin Hollowell, and this is the Resource Stories for Wildlife Resources in the Magone Project planning area. There's three principal laws that direct wildlife management on national forest lands. That's the National Forest Management Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So to set up a baseline or existing conditions for analysis of the project, we use proposed endangered, threatened, and sensitive species, or PETS, management indicator species, featured species, and land birds, including neotropical migratory birds. The table on the left shows a list of the pet species that have the potential to occur on the Malheur National Forest. The table on the right are what we expect to occur in the Magone Project area and the habitat that they're associated with. This is a list of MIS species for the Malheur National Forest and whether they're suspected or documented in the project area. This is a list of the featured species for the Malheur and whether or not they're expected or documented to occur in the Magone Project area. One important habitat type across the forest is dead and defective habitat. Primary cavity excavating birds depend on standing and down dead wood for nesting, roosting, and foraging. And for this reason, 10 woodpeckers were selected to represent dead and defective wood habitat as management indicator species. And by providing adequate dead wood habitat for these birds, it's assumed that adequate habitat would be provided for other species that rely on dead wood for all or part of their life histories. To look at the distribution of dead and defective habitat across the landscape, we use a program called DecAID. DecAID is a decayed wood advisory tool for managing snags, partially dead trees, and down wood for biodiversity in forests. It's used to help managers evaluate effects of forest conditions and existing or proposed management activities on organisms that use snags and down wood. And it breaks down the landscape into wildlife habitat types to address the density and distribution of snags. Those habitat types applicable to the Magone Project area is lodgepole pine, montane mixed conifer, ponderosa pine Doug fir, and east side mixed conifer. And using the Beech Creek and Grub Creek watershed, there's not enough habitat in the lodgepole pine or the montane mixed conifer to use DecAID to look at distribution to be statistically sound. Species of interest that uses dead and defective habitat is a blackback woodpecker. It uses recently bird or insect infested forests to provide key conditions for nesting and foraging, as the bird requires conditions that produce bark and wood-boring beetles. In these areas, they reach their highest densities and reproductive success. Blackback woodpeckers do occur in dense, undisturbed forest and low densities. These are secondary habitats, and they may be important areas for maintaining the birds between big disturbance events. They use smaller snags than most other woodpecker species, and they're of particular importance because they're recently petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act. This chart just shows vegetation type and the percent of vegetation type of habitat for blackback woodpeckers, and you can see that everywhere except for the cold dry veg type, we're at or above HRV on the Malheur for blackback woodpeckers. So this is for ponderosa pine Doug fir habitat type and densities and distribution of snags, large snags greater than 20 inches. And you can see that we're pretty close, we're at or above HRV for most of the density classes. And for smaller snags, those greater than 10 inches, for ponderosa pine Doug fir habitat type, same picture, we're at or above HRV, just like the 20-inch, except for the 0 class, which is good, which means there's a less percentage of the landscape with 0 snags per acre than historically occurred. For the east side mixed conifer habitat type, it's a little bit different. This is for large snags greater than 20 inches, and there's quite a deficit of snags on the landscape in this habitat type. And for smaller snags, those greater than 10 inches, once again, we're deficit in this habitat type. Another important habitat in the Magone Project area is old growth habitat. Indicator species pileated woodpecker and American marten are used as indicators. We have dedicated old growth for pileated woodpeckers and American marten, and in some cases dedicated for both. For these dedicated stands, there should be replacement old growth stands for pileated woodpeckers and martens, and then for those associated with pileated woodpeckers, there should be pileated woodpecker feeding areas. The table basically shows some data for the old growth stands in the Magone planting area. You can see what they're dedicated for in the species column, how many acres, and in the last four columns, what the forest plan standard is for acreages and how many acres were deficit in the Magone planting area for each of those old growth stands. This map just shows the distribution of old growth, dedicated old growth stands in the Magone Project area. The darker color is dedicated for marten, and the lighter color is dedicated for pileated woodpeckers. So marten is particularly important in old growth habitat because it was determined to have a low likelihood of maintaining viable populations on the Malheur. So habitat was mapped for this MIS species, as well as several others, and acres of habitat were determined using forest-wide vegetation layer using FS-Veg Spatial Analyzer. So on the forest, there's approximately 28,000 acres of primary and secondary marten habitat. In the Magone Project area, there's almost 1,400 acres. So 4% of the primary habitat on the Malheur National Forest is in the Magone area, and 6% of secondary habitat on the forest is in the Magone area. This just shows the distribution of primary, which is the darker color, and secondary, which is the lighter color habitat on the landscape. Rocky Mountain Elk were selected as a management indicator species for their economic and social value and for their documented response to changes in forest cover, forage quality, and road densities. And in the Magone Project planting area, there's approximately 14,200 acres of winter range and 12,850 acres of summer range. And this map just shows how those are delineated on the landscape. Connectivity corridors is another topic of interest in the Magone area. Connectivity corridors would be designated during project design as required by Regional Foresters Amendment Number 2 or the East Side Screens. Our goal of creating connectivity is to manage stands and corridors at higher canopy densities when compared to more intensively managed stands located just outside of the corridors. Corridors would connect late and old structured stands, basically old growth, to allow for movement of old growth dependent species. And corridors established for old growth species in the project area would also allow for big game, migratory, and dispersal movements in areas that have higher cover, late and old structure habitat for neotropical migratory birds and several other wildlife species. There's one known northern goshawk nest site in the Magone Project area. The post-fledging area has not yet been delineated, and blue grouse have been documented in the higher elevations of the project area, and these are the only two featured species that are documented in the area so far. One management area inside the Magone Project area is the Nipple Butte Wildlife Emphasis Area with non-scheduled timber harvest. It's 5,795 acres inside the inventory roadless area. The plan directs to manage to provide high-quality fish and wildlife habitat and water quality. It says that timber harvest will be on a non-scheduled basis and used only to meet wildlife and or fish habitat objectives, and to provide opportunities for high-quality semi-primitive dispersed recreation. And this is a map that shows where the wildlife emphasis area sits in the Magone Project area and the boundary of the roadless area.